I'm John Heilemann.
And I'm Mark Halperin. And with all due respect to Jeb Bush, we're going to break so much news tonight, not even you can fix it. On the show tonight, John Ellis and Bush, our interview with the former Florida governor later in the show. But first, the other governors and a lot more. A majority of American governors are saying no to Syrian refugees. Speaker Paul Ryan said today that a bill is coming that would, quote, pause the flow of those refugees coming into the U.S. And the heat from the president's feisty Monday press conference has followed him to the Philippines. John, based on what's happened so far in the fallout since last Friday's massacre in Paris, terrorist attacks, what's the biggest fallout in American politics so far?
Well, first of all, this issue has become the predominant issue. Let's just say that's the simple thing to say. But there's two different discussions taking place on two different tracks in which different candidates have different strengths and weaknesses. There's one that's taking place about refugees, in which the Republican Party is largely united in substance, if not in tone. Then there's another discussion taking place about what to actually do about ISIS or ISIL or Islamic State, in which the candidates are having divergent points of view, and their strengths and weaknesses are very different relative to those who have actual experience, some in foreign policy, some not, and others who are the more outsider candidates who have less of that kind of traditional experience in this area.
So on the refugee question, one of the topics we talked to Jeb Bush about today was his view of the question of what should be done with refugees who want to come into the country. Listen to what he said.
We have systems in place. We should, if there's any kind of concern, we shouldn't allow people in. But right. I don't think we should eliminate our support for refugees. It's been a noble tradition in our country for many years.
Including Muslim refugees? You don't want to ban Muslim refugees from coming to the United States. Forget about the bill.
The answer to this, though, is not to ban people from coming. The answer is to lead to resolve the problem in Syria. That's the ultimate answer, and that's my focus.
So Bush later clarified there's a nuanced position. He doesn't begrudge the governors their view that if they don't want them in their states under the current conditions, that's fine. But he did have a pretty inclusive rhetoric about the importance of keeping the door open to Syrian refugees.
I find his clarification confusing in the sense that what the campaign now says is that he's against a federal ban like Ted Cruz is proposing, but that if there are issues with verification and vetting, he's fine with the governors having their own bans. I don't understand. I don't think there's a lot of intellectual consistency in this view. To me, it sounds more like Jeb Bush said something that was humane and compassionate and then realized that that might be politically problematic for him and is trying to kind of walk it back.
The impact, as you said, is basically in the two areas. Right now, refugees, I think that will subside.
Yes.
But what it has done is really teased out within the Republican Party a wide range of views, some intellectual, but a lot of political posturing. Because the candidates right now, I think, and Secretary Clinton and Bernie Sanders would be in the same boat, they don't know exactly where they want to be, and it's forcing them to talk about it and think about it a lot more than before.
And it's a hard issue where there's a lot of division within the Republican Party. All right, take it from us. When you see on-the-record criticism of presidential candidates in the press, it's usually a pretty big deal. And this today is a huge deal because the call is coming from inside the House. The House in question is the House of Carson. This story today in the New York Times, which quotes Dwayne Claridge, who the New York Times described as a top Carson advisor on terrorism and national security, saying that, quote, nobody has been able to sit down with him, that is Dr. Carson, and have him get one iota of intelligent information about the Middle East. When we saw that, I think it's fair to say that we thought, WTF. Mark, what is up with that, and how big a problem is this story and the underlying issue for Dr. Carson?
Well, there's no question that this guy Claridge, who's been around a long time, who's involved in Iran-Contra, is someone who's talked to Dr. Carson about foreign policy, national security.
And to whom he's very close personally for a long time.
Yeah, but there are some of Carson's folks are saying this is not someone who really was giving him main, consistent advice on foreign policy. Look, the elites think Dr. Carson doesn't know anything about foreign policy. Some of them think he's actually not a smart man.
Right.
And they've been waiting, particularly since his Fox News interview on Sunday, where Carson gave halting responses to a question, that this is the moment where Carson's going to be exposed as not ready for prime time. I think this Times story is going to unravel as something that will actually have an impact on Dr. Carson, which is not to say he knows the most about foreign policy. It's not to say he may not have trouble, but this story is blowing up, and it's going to blow away.
The problem is that this story, as you say, reinforces a narrative which many people have in their gut they think is true. Secondly, there's more than one thing in this story. There's that quote. There's also the question of where Dr. Carson got his information about the claim that the Chinese are in Syria. There's the Fox News performance and quotes from other Carson advisors reporters saying that Carson knew that he blew it, that he froze, that he seemed depressed after the interview. It's the composite picture. And again, the story may or may not be perfectly accurate.
Just like
but the composite picture is
like
problematic for him.
On this one. This is just like the stuff about Carson and whether he was exaggerating his biography. There are real issues here on this question of foreign policy.
There are.
But many of the ones you just cited are not. He didn't say there were Chinese troops in China, in Syria. He didn't say it. The implication was clear. All right, later on in the program, Armstrong Williams, who's quoted in that New York Times story extensively and one of Dr. Carson's closest advisors, will join us to talk more about Dr. Carson, foreign policy, and the New York Times story. All right, on today's edition of Republicans Gone Wild, Rand Paul said in a radio interview that Marco Rubio previously opposed border control efforts. Then Jeb Bush in his interview with me, and John told us that Rubio and Cruz are bellicose and that Donald Trump could not be trusted to be president. And last night, Marco Rubio used a Wall Street Journal event here in Washington to call out both Ted Cruz and Rand Paul for their past positions on U.S. intelligence gathering.
It's a distinctive issue of debate in the presidential race. At least two of my colleagues in the Senate aspiring to the presidency, Senator Cruz in particular, have voted to weaken the U.S. intelligence programs just in the last month and a half. And the weakening of our intelligence gathering capabilities leaves America vulnerable. And that is exactly what's happened.
So, John, we've now seen enough Republican on Republican attacks to ask the question, which will be extraordinarily important going forward through Iowa and beyond. Which one of the Republican candidates seems to have the best skills at taking on and taking down his colleagues?
Well, I want to just put Donald Trump aside for a moment because he has been, throughout the campaign, an expert at getting in the heads of his rivals and taking them down. You almost got to put him in a separate category. In this more recent set of a flurry of Republican on Republican attacks, I think Marco Rubio is doing a really nice job taking care of Ted Cruz. Even though Rubio has big vulnerabilities, every time Cruz goes at him, Rubio finds another way to take Cruz down a notch. This issue here, lumping in Ted Cruz with Edward Snowden, that's good with the Republican base.
Yeah, I think Rubio has been surprisingly cutting and good, but I think Ted Cruz is the second best after Trump right now. Ted Cruz, a lawyer, very sharp mind, has the courage of his convictions, and is fearless about choosing his moments. I think you see with Rubio, you see with Rand Paul, you see with John Kasich, you see with Jeb Bush to some extent. They always feel they need to fight back the minute they're punched. Cruz is a guy who understands the importance of timing in politics, and I think he's shown he can wait and counterpunch when place and time of his choosing.
Here's the thing about the two of these guys that we're going to agree about, even though we rank them slightly differently. The two things that are true, they both have thought for a long time that they would be the nominee, or be at least in the top tier. So both sides have been preparing for this moment for a long time. And the second is that they both really do not like each other very much, and this will get very ugly and nasty very quick.
There are also a lot of oppo, including Jeb Bush, which we learned today in our interview. When we come back, that very interview, a long discussion, quite interesting with Jeb Bush on national security and more. We did it today earlier in Columbia, South Carolina. We'll have that for you when we come back in just 60 seconds.
This morning, Mark and I were in Columbia, South Carolina, where we sat down with former Florida Governor Jeb Bush. Tomorrow, he's going to be giving a foreign policy speech at the Citadel Military College. We asked him about the threat of ISIS, how to handle Syrian refugees in the United States, and his governing philosophy when it comes to sending American troops abroad.
We're going to talk about a bunch of stuff. I want to start, though, with one of the most basic questions for any commander-in-chief. Cases where the United States is not directly hit, but where American interests are implicated. What is the Jeb Bush doctrine for when and how you commit American troops on the ground overseas?
I think you have to have a compelling national security interest, and in the case of Islamic terrorism, we have it. This is a unique circumstance, not seen before in history, where you have a caliphate that has been formed whose energy is maintained and strengthened by its existence, and its ability to provoke acts of terror around the world is real. And so I think this is a direct threat to our national security interests.
So you've said you want to declare war against ISIS.
Well, because they're declared war on us.
And yet you've not answered directly when asked about the amount of American ground troops beyond special forces. So if this is a case where we should declare war, if there's a vital American interest at stake, why aren't you for substantial ground troops?
Because I can't give you a number without the Commander-in-Chief. The President of the United States would tell his military advisors, give me options for a strategy to take out ISIS. And I don't know what the answer would be to those options. I can't tell you that. I don't have those skills.
It doesn't necessarily involve substantial ground troops?
It could.
But not necessarily.
Not necessarily. I think that if we could mobilize the support of the neighborhood, which has got to be essential, we can't do this alone. Support from Europe, support from Turkey, from Egypt, from Jordan, all of these countries directly impacted by this grave threat, certainly the Persian Gulf countries, we could have an international force led by Americans for sure, and certainly with our air power, where we could destroy ISIS. And I think that's the goal. It isn't to contain. That's a joke. Containing only gives them energy and makes them an even greater threat.
When you talk about declaring war, there are people out there, some members of your party who want right now to invoke Article 5.
Yeah.
Do you want to do that?
I think if France calls for it, there should be a serious conversation about that. I think this requires American leadership, whether it's through NATO or directly. The net result is we need to lead. We need to be the leader of this effort. There should be a clear stated objective, and we should use awesome force, not incremental force, which is what we're doing today.
So when you talk about declaring war, I think there's a broad view that America is a war-weary country after Afghanistan, after Iraq. Do you agree that the country is war-weary?
It is war-weary for sure, and the use of the declaration of war was not a formal, formal statement, but to recognize that Islamic terrorism and the terrorists that headed up are declared war on us, we should take them seriously. Sometimes when people say things, we should actually believe what they say.
So how do you deal with that war weariness? How do you muster the kind of public support that would be necessary for an aggressive action against ISIS? How do you get over that war weariness in America?
I think you have to give people a sense that there's a clear strategy, that we're not doing this incrementally, that we're not going to be stuck in a quagmire, that if we do it, we're doing it with all the resources that we can bring to bear and the international community with us, and that we're quick and decisive, and then we move on. I think the fear of weariness is legitimate, that if we get into extended wars and there's no clear strategy and we get stuck, that the costs are high and Americans lose their life.
Is that the condition that exists in the conflict in Afghanistan now?
There's better stability today. We're moving towards a stable Afghanistan for sure, but it's the longest war in American history.
But are we stuck there?
It's the longest war.
Are Americans right to say, look what's happened in Afghanistan, we're wary of going in other places?
If we can, in the case of Afghanistan, similar to Korea, similar to Japan, provide a force that allows for security to exist, similar to Iraq with 3,500 troops now, that is not necessarily prolonging the war. That's creating a secure country that will allow us not to have to come back in. I think that's appropriate. But the reason, I'm answering honestly your question, it's a good one. The people are weary of war, and so a commander-in-chief, the president, has to create a clear strategy for people to know that this is something that's not going to go on forever. This president, twice in the last year and a half now, has said we don't have a strategy. It's pretty breathtaking if you think about it. We have 3,500 troops in Iraq and no strategy. We have 50 special operators in Syria with no strategy. We have warfighters that are risking their lives over, in their fighting in the air with no strategy.
Let me ask you about refugees. President Obama yesterday said that we should have no religious test for compassion when it comes to the Syrian refugees coming in. And he went on to say that it was sort of shameful and not American to suggest that there should be a difference. First of all, let me just ask you whether you've said that we should focus on Christian refugees from Syria. Did you take President Obama's comments personally? Did you take that as a direct shot at you?
Well, he didn't mention my name, but yeah, I mean, I've had this view for a long while that religious minorities in the Middle East and around the world are deserving of our support, because but for us who?
Right.
So I believe that we should take a stand to help people. In Mosul, Mass is no longer given, no longer said after 1,400, 1,500 years. The Yazidis are being exterminated. You have enslavement, beheadings. The brutality of Islamic terrorism is such that I think we do have a duty to act.
But you don't disagree with the fact that Muslims are the primary, they're suffering, the vast majority of sufferers, and the refugees are Muslims. So why?
Well, the vast majority of people are Muslims for sure.
So why discriminate against Syrian refugees?
There's no discrimination to simply say that you want to protect religious minorities that are being exterminated. The solution, as it relates to the innocents in Syria, in Iraq is to create a strategy to destroy ISIS and to bring about change as it relates to the Assad regime. That's where American leadership needs to be played. If we're just responding to a crisis by our inaction of creating an overflow of refugees, I mean, that's not an answer. That's just once again reacting to events that you didn't help try to deter.
So 26 or 27, I believe now, governors have said no Syrian refugees. They want no Syrian refugees in their states. Senator Cruz has introduced a bill saying no Syrian refugees at all in the United States, Muslim Syrian refugees in the United States. You agree? You support that bill? And how do you feel about those governors?
I haven't seen the bill, and I think people are legitimately concerned about the efficiency, the competency of the Obama administration as it relates to screening processes. But we have systems in place. We should, if there's any kind of concern, we shouldn't allow people in. But I don't think we should eliminate our support for refugees. It's been a noble tradition in our country for many years.
Including Muslim refugees? You don't want to ban Muslim refugees from coming to the United States?
I don't.
Forget about the bill.
The answer to this, though, is not to ban people from coming. The answer is to lead to resolve the problem in Syria. That's the ultimate answer, and that's my focus.
You mentioned air power before. Some are saying now, given that ISIS is not showing respect for human life, to say the least, that the West needs to lower the concern that it's had about casualties, civilian casualties in bombing. How do you grapple with that?
Well, in my briefings about this, there's some frustration by military commanders that the lawyers are on top of every sortie. And I think if we view this as a fight for our time, that this is a threat to Western civilization, then we need to be aggressively pursuing a strategy to take out ISIS, and the warfighters need to have their hands untied. You can balance this, perhaps still recognizing that there's a lot of innocent people in these. They're embedded inside of Mosul, for example. Trump's idea of bombing Mosul, I mean, or whatever he's saying, that's just not, you don't do that. You're going to have ground troops. There's going to have to be an international fighting force. In the case of Iraq, it would be the Iraqi military along with Sunni tribal leaders and the Kurds. And we would be partners in that.
But at this point, would you say civilian casualties, targets will have to be hit, even if they're more risk of civilian casualties than would have been acceptable before?
My position on this hasn't changed. This is war, and we need to treat it as war.
So even if there's civilian casualties, if the
this
Pentagon
is war.
says
this is war.
That's a target,
it's not you don't go out of your way to kill innocents. We have a noble tradition doing that, but I think this administration has not viewed it. They view it as a law enforcement exercise. They have lawyers on top of it. That's not the attitude that you need to be successful.
Just ask you one more time. So civilian casualties are just part of war, and so
of course they are, Mark. I mean, look at history. Has there ever been a time where we don't have? You have to. It's not a video game. This is why it's a serious endeavor to when you're aspiring to be president of the United States, to send men and women in harm's way. It's a serious undertaking, and you have to do it recognizing that we want to win, and do so in a way that allows for a more secure world.
We'll have more from our sit-down with Jeb Bush on Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, Muslims in America, and why Jeb's rhetoric about Islam is different from what his brother's was, after this.
And now for more of our interview with Jeb Bush from earlier today in Columbia, South Carolina, on his foreign policy vision and principles. We asked him about a recent remark by President Obama about his brother, Bush 43.
He made a real point of praising your brother yesterday for avoiding saying that we were at war with Islam. People in your brother's administration have said that not only did the administration avoid saying we're not at war with Islam, but they avoided the phrase we're at war with radical Islam. Elliot Abrams has said that, argued for why that was important.
Yeah.
You now say we must say that we're at war with radical Islam. So what's the reason for the difference between your and your brother's postures on this?
We may have a difference, but it's the avoidance of it that seems to be amazing. These Democratic candidates and President Obama get all twisted up like a pretzel to avoid the term Islamic terrorism in the same sentence. And this is an ideology. This is a political ideology. They've co-opted a religion, but they are Muslim extreme terrorists, and they need to be taken out. I think this is a question of semantics, but the simple fact is, to avoid this conversation creates a whole set of policies that is defeatist in its nature.
Let me ask you about one of the things.
No one, by the way, I don't think anybody would have suggested my brother wasn't focused on destroying radical Islam. Whether he didn't use the term or not, I don't think anybody ever thought that. He was a little weak on this.
There was a reason, though, why he avoided using it. Again, a lot of people from his administration made the point that they went out of their way to avoid using that term because they did not want to have this cast as a religious war.
But here, the world changes, and so in 2017, the threat of ISIS is, as it gains strength, the threat of the black flag of ISIS going up in Mecca, in Medina, in Cairo, in other countries. And so I think the rest of the Muslim world now sees this threat in a different way than they might have 15 years ago.
Let me ask you about Donald Trump real quick. He said yesterday that we may need to surveil some mosques in the United States in a more intense way than we do now, and he's open to the idea of even shutting some of those mosques down. How do you feel about that issue?
I have confidence in the FBI doing their job, protecting civil liberties and doing their job. Donald Trump's been all over the map on the question of ISIS. He at one point said, let Russia take ISIS out, and then he said, let ISIS take Assad out. Now he wants to bomb ISIS. He doesn't want to create a strategy and have the United States military lead an effort. It's a pretty good example of why he can't be trusted being President of the United States, in my mind.
You said you trust the FBI. Can you envision any circumstances where you would say, yeah, mosques should be shut down?
No, I can't, unless there is identified threats to the national security of our country. I think we've got to be cautious about the world we're moving towards. This is to protect our freedom, not to take freedom away.
Assad, you mentioned him a couple of times. He seems to be the cause of a lot of instability, not just in the region, but in the world now. Why wouldn't it be appropriate to do what a previous president did with Saddam Hussein and go into Damascus and take him out?
I think it is appropriate. This is what I've been saying. I gave a speech at the Reagan Library saying that you can't deal with ISIS without dealing with Assad. He has killed over 200,000 innocent people in his country. He is supported by radical Shia terrorists. The notion that somehow we're going to trade sides, if you will, in a very complicated way, I think we need to simplify this. There are terrorists, Shia and Sunni, that want to destroy the modern Arab world, and they want to destroy Western civilization. And that focus is where our focus needs to be, is to attack both sides of that.
Right. I know you think he should go, but should the American military remove him?
I think we ought to create a no-fly zone to limit his power. And
that's
I think
not going to get him out of office.
Well, it could if we're serious about building a force trained by the United States, an international fighting force, the third option, if you will. It used to be called the Syrian Free Army.
But you don't
if you recall,
you supported removing Saddam Hussein by force. This is a guy who's used weapons of mass destruction against his own people, who's a threat to Israel, who's a threat to the region.
I think Assad can be removed diplomatically when he has no other options, and that requires American leadership, and that requires a presence that would create a third force between ISIS and Assad. And that's what's been lacking. That's what the president promised, and he backed away from.
Up next, what Jeb Bush told us about Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz and their foreign policy credentials, right after this.
And now, the grand finale of our conversation with Jeb Bush in Columbia, South Carolina.
You're going to talk tomorrow, Wednesday, at the Citadel about a lot of things, including Homeland Security.
Yeah.
Is the Homeland safe now?
I think it's safe, but it needs to be safer. I think one of the things that I found to be unfortunate was in the reauthorization of the Patriot Act, eliminating the metadata program, which will end by this month. I think we need to relook at that. You can protect civil liberties in the homeland, inside the country, and also identify terrorist messages that are coming in to do us harm. And there's no evidence that anybody's civil liberties were violated with this program. And it's part of a mosaic of efforts to keep us safe, and I think it ought to be reinstated.
National security is pretty serious stuff, and you and other people running to be the nominee are pretty intensely critical of the president. But talk about your optimism about America winning this fight. Talk about what that looks like, what a victory looks like, and how Americans can be hopeful about what's going on rather than just scared.
Well, history is rife of examples of the United States leadership creating a more secure world for ourselves and for the world. And it's when we lead that it gives people confidence that they will follow. What we see now are Arab nations going to consult with Putin. Never has that happened before. We see an aggressive China. We see nation states that are taking advantage of our weakness, and we see
with all due respect, this sounds pretty negative.
Huh?
With all due respect, that still sounds pretty negative.
But it is negative. We're living in a really negative time, but I think we can fix that. We have military superiority to deal with this. The caliphate can't deal with an American technological force that is second to none. And if we garner the international support, which is my point, right now our friends, our potential friends, no longer trust us. They don't think that we have their back. Look, in the Middle East, the first signal we're not serious is when we disrespect Israel. When we when there's space between Israel and the United States, the rest of the Arab world goes, well, how are we going to get a fair shake if Israel doesn't? This uncertainty needs to be resolved, and that requires a president that is consistent, that is humble, who doesn't use grandiose language, but when people know that he's going to act, he's going to do it. He's going to have the back of the military, and he's going to create a force that will be successul.
I think any fair-minded person would say that we're right now still dealing with the legacies, the foreign policy legacies of the past two administrations, the Obama administration and your brother's administration. So I want to ask you two-part questions. They'll be relatively succinct, though.
This is a math program.
The first, now you'll be on this. So when you think about President Obama, just think about discrete national security decisions, not broad things, but discrete things. What's the biggest mistake he's made, and what's the best thing that he's done, other than taking out bin Laden?
I was going to give him credit for that.
Take that off the table.
I think continuing to use the drone efforts in Pakistan had a positive effect, and it was against what he said in the campaign. It's the only place I think where he reversed himself from a political position to one after being briefed was the right thing to do. The mistakes were rife of mistakes, but I think it's the grandiosity of his language without following it up. It's the red line. It's Russia's a regional power. ISIS is the JV team. ISIS is contained. All this stuff puts him in a really vulnerable position for the rest of the world. Right. And the geography of this is the whole world. So anytime the president says something and doesn't act on it, it has an impact 1,000 miles away from there. And that's the problem. And I would say, just from a foreign policy, to try to answer your second question before you ask it, I think we have to stop being reactive in our foreign policy. The past is the past. Learn from it. Move on. Prepare for the future. And so whether it's the president, the previous presidents, my dad, Clinton, my brother, Obama, learn from all of the lessons, the good and the bad, to project America's presence and leadership in the world.
But let me ask,
Did I get close to the question?
Well, you're in the general vicinity, but I do want to ask you the specific second part of my question, which is I just asked you about Obama, best and biggest mistake and best success. Think about your brother. What's again, the discrete policy decision that was the best thing and the biggest mistake?
I think both relate to Iraq. One was the surge, which was an incredibly courageous act against popular will, jeopardizing his legacy, huge threats to all the stuff that presidents are supposed to be thinking about in their sixth year or fifth year. It was the right thing to do, and it was a great success. I think the beginning of the Iraq War, not bringing security to the country, focusing on other things, was an error that created the need for the surge, to be honest with you.
You've been pretty clear today and previously about Donald Trump and what you think of his capacity to be commander-in-chief. And you've been somewhat clear also on Ben Carson and your view of some of the things he said. I want to ask you not to pit you against him, but just to get a sense of your view on Senator Cruz, Senator Rubio. In terms of their experience and their policy positions on national security, how would you tell voters of South Carolina and elsewhere you're better than them to be commander-in-chief?
Well, I'm probably more consistent. I'm probably less bellicose. I try not to use language that...
You're talking about both Cruz and Rubio now?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, look, on Syria, both of them voted against the authorization of force. When one didn't vote because it never got to the floor, and one in the Foreign Relations Committee voted against the president's authorization of force. And now Marco has got a different reason why he did it, but back then it was he didn't think that we had an interest there. I think we do. And Ted Cruz said something to the effect of a great spin of the phrase, as I recall, something that we shouldn't be Assad's Air Force. Well, there's a broader issue at stake here, and it is the fact that there's a group of people that have declared war on Western civilization and on our country. And I think we need to be resolute as it relates to that. I've been consistent about it.
So that's one vote, which I take your point on for both of them. But more broadly, how would you say you're better than Senator Cruz, Senator Rubio to be the next commander-in-chief?
I just think I could be a good commander-in-chief. I'm not saying that they'd be bad ones. It's hard for me.
So you wouldn't put him in the same category as Trump and Carson? Well, or would you?
I'm not putting anybody in any category. I just think of all the people running, I think I have the skills, the leadership skills, the ability to make tough decisions, the ability to draw with a little humility enough information before you feel like you're compelled to act. Some of this just relates to life experience. Look, I've lived 62 years old. I've gone through good times and bad. I've had to make difficult decisions across the board, and this is a tough job. And it requires a principle. It requires, a set of guiding principles to act and then to stick with it.
So those 20 additional years you have on those two young senators, you think that's a big difference in terms of experience?
I think it's helpful. I think it's helpful as it relates to foreign policy, for sure. I've lived overseas. I've traveled overseas extensively. I've done business overseas. I'm a student of foreign policy. I think I got what it takes. That's not to say others don't. I think that any candidate running has a better foreign policy than Hillary Clinton, who effectively in South Carolina 2 weeks ago, not effectively, said she would not be any more aggressive than President Obama as it relates to foreign policy.
If supporters of Mr. Trump and Dr. Carson were to say, with all due respect, being governor of
they
a
probably
state,
wouldn't say with all due respect, but your show would have to
branding.
Yes, just for branding. With all due respect, being governor of a state gives Jeb Bush or any other governor no more relevant experience to commanding the American, to being commander-in-chief than what our guys have done, running a business empire, being a neurosurgeon. What would you say about your gubernatorial? What is it particularly about your experience in office that makes you more qualified to be commander-in-chief than those two guys?
I was commander-in-chief of the second or third largest National Guard that was deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Over during the life of my tenure, probably 5,000 guardsmen and women were serving in Iraq, Kuwait, and Afghanistan. I've done 3 or 4 trade missions a year as governor. I lived overseas. I've done business overseas. As I said, I have intellectual curiosity. I haven't gotten it all figured out. I love talking to people that are really smart about things that relate to foreign policy and be able to convert their ideas into a practical plan. When you're a governor, you take ideas and you turn them into reality. You develop strategies and you fight to make sure that those strategies achieve the desired result. I'm not sure in the world of Dr. Carson and Mr. Trump that they've had the breadth of experience that I've had.
Governor, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Appreciate it.
I'm going to take one of those.
You ready to be president?
Damn right I am.
Our thanks to Governor Jeb Bush for spending all that time with us. When we come back, we will unpack what Jeb said with our Bloomberg Politics chief Jeb reporter, Mike Bender, after this word from our sponsors. Here to talk to us about all things Jeb, our Bloomberg Politics reporter on the Bush Beat, Michael C. Bender. Mike, today, after our interview, we put a little bit of it out early this morning, late this morning, early this afternoon, and you wrote off it. Mm-hmm. The question that I asked Governor Bush about refugees was a little confused because I talked to him about, mentioned both that governors were trying to keep refugees from coming in and that Senator Cruz was trying to institute a federal policy banning refugees from coming in. Those questions were not very cleanly asked, and the Bush campaign ended up pushing back and saying that we had kind of misconstrued his answer. Just explain to me what you saw when you saw the interview and how this all played out for the rest of the day.
I saw the interview, John, and I talked to some foreign policy experts after the interview. What Bush said in the context of how he would handle Syrian refugees is not controversial within foreign policy circles. The type of war hawks favoring a robust military, the type of folks who pushed back on Bush for putting James Baker on his list of foreign policy advisors. This is not controversial there. This is controversial on the Republican primary trail, where and Bush's team is very sensitive to the governor, the former governor, seeming to be critical of Republican governors, which he wasn't. He ignored that part of your question completely.
Correct.
Or being described as soft on the Syrian refugee issue, which I don't think is true from the interview. He very clearly said that he doesn't think that there should be an outright ban on Syrian refugees, but those who can't be vetted shouldn't be allowed in. If there's concern, I think there is concern. There's different. I think there's competing.
So did he say anything different today than what is currently the Republican mainstream on the position about Syrian refugees?
Well, what's the Republican mainstream here anymore?
I put air quotes around it with my voice. Did he say anything different than the other candidates, than congressional leaders, than the governors?
He said it in a different way, and this has been Bush's struggle from the beginning. Most foreign policy experts say this is a reasonable position for Bush to have. Bush has been penalized on the campaign trail for being reasonable. He wants to explain these issues. He wants to make government work better. He tried to do that in Florida, agree with his results or not. But primary voters don't want to be persuaded. They want to be validated.
It seemed to me that what he was saying was that he seemed to be saying he did not want to stop Syrian refugees from coming into the country, and that many of these governors do. That's where it seemed to me that there was some disagreement between him and the way the governors feel about this, even though many people have questions about the vetting system.
I think there's some nuance there. Republican governors are saying, not necessarily don't let them into the country, don't let them into my state, and I don't want to be responsible for it.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Bender, wish we had more time with you. Up next, we'll have Ben Carson's personal advisor and close personal friend, Armstrong Williams. He'll be here to talk about that New York Times story we mentioned earlier, and we'll be right back in 60 seconds. Joining us now to talk about that New York Times story about Ben Carson and his foreign policy is Armstrong Williams, a longtime personal advisor to Dr. Carson. Thank you, Armstrong, for coming in. The campaign has a statement you may know about Mr. Claridge, in which they say essentially that he is an elderly gentleman, he's been taken advantage of by the New York Times, and it says he is clearly not one of Dr. Carson's top advisors. In the New York Times story, you're quoted saying he's a mentor to Dr. Carson. Can you explain the contradiction between what the campaign is saying and your view of the matter?
Well, Mr. Claridge is a wonderful human being who has served this country well, putting his life on the line. When Dr. Carson was thinking about running for president a couple of years ago, Mr. Claridge and his team reached out to Dr. Carson, and they have been advising him ever since. They have met twice over the last 2 years, and we've spoken by telephone probably 4 times.
The quote that is getting all the attention is pretty damning from Mr. Claridge about Dr. Carson. Says nobody has been able to sit down with him and have him get one iota of intelligent information about the Middle East. Does that ring true to you, or does that seem overstated on the part of Mr. Claridge?
Well, it's not true, but obviously Mr. Claridge, it's a statement that he cares about Dr. Carson, and Dr. Carson is someone that he believes in, and Mr. Claridge is probably not aware that Dr. Carson talks to 13 or 14 different people on foreign policy all the time. And Mr. Claridge, particularly at his state in life, he feels very strongly about what he believes in his experience that he feels very few people share. And he feels that the more time, if he had more time to speak to Dr. Carson, he feels very deeply that he could help enhance his foreign bona fides. Obviously, because Dr. Carson talks to many other people, Mr. Claridge is probably not on his calendar able to meet with Dr. Carson, because Dr. Carson rarely gets to Washington, D.C. for a face-to-face, is what Mr. Claridge wants. So I think it's more of an issue that he cares. And yes, it's true, he's not aware of all the other people that Dr. Carson talks to, but Mr. Claridge is quite well-meaning.
But you know, as a matter of fact, that they've only met face-to-face twice to talk about policy?
I know that for a fact, because why I know? I set up all the meetings. So I've been on the phone call with every meeting and every conference call they've had.
If you're right, and I have no reason to believe you're not, the New York Times characterization of his role in the campaign seems a bit overstated.
Well, I spoke with Trip Gabriel. I gave him Mr. Claridge's name. So I take responsibility for that. I think Mr. Claridge has played an important role for Dr. Carson over the last 2 years. And I'm not going to diminish anything that Mr. Claridge said.
Let's leave him aside. You know the reason why this story posted on the Times website today is causing such a stir,
because there are people in the establishment, elites, who say, well, this shows what we've thought all along, which Dr. Carson's not a smart man. Dr. Carson doesn't have any foreign policy credentials. He doesn't know much about foreign policy. And it comes on the heels of that Fox News Sunday interview in which he failed to answer a question. It's caused a lot of chatter. I was surprised to see you quoted in the story saying he froze. I think that question is not that interesting or important a question. Who would you call first? You call everybody. So my question to you is, did you think that this much discussed answer on Fox News Sunday was a bad answer or not? Because you say your quote is saying he froze.
Well, Dr. Carson was very dismissive of the question. He did not think it was a question because it was hypothetical. And Dr. Carson doesn't like answering hypotheticals, and so he intentionally did not answer the question.
So you say he's been briefed on it so many times, I guess he just froze. That's different from what you're saying now.
Well, you know, listen, I used the word froze with Trip Gabriel. He's absolutely correct. And when you're talking, and that's the word I use, but the fact is Dr. Carson was very dismissive of the question.
As you think about that answer now, no question that elites have said that answer is some sort of, iconic moment that shows that Ben Carson doesn't know what he's talking about. It showed up in news stories that way, as if this were some huge thing. You're saying from Dr. Carson's point of view, he just thought it was a silly question and therefore chose not to answer it.
That is a fact. And why I know that, because I had an extensive discussion with him earlier this morning about the Fox interview.
What did he say?
He said he was very dismissive. He just thought it was a silly question. And I said to him, I said, look, when you're on these national forums as well as in the debates, when they ask these questions, while you may think they're silly, if you don't answer them, people may think that you don't know the answer, in which you've been asked that question 100 times and we know you know the answer. And so he concluded that no matter what, if he's in these forums, he has to answer these questions.
Let's go back to Mr. Claridge for a second here. The claim that Dr. Carson made in the debate about the Chinese being present in Syria provoked a lot of skepticism and a lot of criticism. Whatever level of advice Mr. Claridge has been giving to Dr. Carson, the story claims that he was the person who got Dr. Carson in touch with a freelance intelligence operative who was the source of that claim. So let me ask you two questions about that. The first is, the campaign, Dr. Carson no longer believes that the Chinese are in Syria, correct? He's basically acknowledged that was wrong.
I think sometimes you don't hear what Dr. Carson is saying. Dr. Carson never said there were troops on the ground. He said in terms of munitions, ammunition, advisors, and intelligence, the Chinese are in Syria, and he stands by that statement.
Right. So he stands by the statement. His view is that the Chinese are, by the terms on which he was making the statement, what he meant when he said the Chinese are in Syria, he still believes that to be the case. And this intelligence operative, who Claridge is now saying was totally wrong in this story, on the record, he's still standing by his original statement and saying Dr. Claridge's statement here in the New York Times about this information being erroneous is false.
That is, if you're to assume that the information only came from Mr. Claridge's source. Dr. Carson has got this from many sources of intelligence community that he's spoken to.
For Claridge clear.
Yes.
But what you're saying is, in this case, the New York Times this story is leaving a misleading impression, because they're accepting Claridge's account that Dr. Carson was basing what he said about China strictly on what Claridge's information was and the person Claridge put him in touch with, but that's not right. Dr. Carson had other sources to say what he said.
But that was very clear when I appeared on MSNBC last week, that Dr. Carson had a plethora of advisors where the source came from, that it was not just the source that Mr. Claridge acknowledged that he put Dr. Carson in touch with.
Let's go to the underlying reason why this story, again, is getting so much attention. Do you think Dr. Carson is well briefed and well versed in national security issues?
Listen, guys, the landscape of foreign policy, the country, and the dynamics are changing every day. You take any of those presidential candidates, you tell me what foreign policy experience they have, except some talking memo or some briefing they have. Dr. Carson is the kind of thinker, he wants to immerse himself in the details, like he did in learning his psychology course, like he did in learning medicine. Dr. Carson learns. He learns from 13 or 14 different people. He wants to learn it just as well as they. So the bottom line, on any given day, any of these candidates can be asked a question about foreign policy that they could not answer. Dr. Carson is still on a learning curve. There's much for him to learn. He is not perfect. He will never be perfect, but he continues to surround himself with people and engage people that can enhance his foreign policy credentials.
I appreciate the candor of that answer, but it's such a dangerous time for the world. Shouldn't voters be looking or expecting in their presidential candidate someone who's not on a learning curve, but is ready today to be commander-in-chief?
Listen, all of us no matter how well you know your profession. There's something that you new that you learn about it. If you're going to find a candidate that is perfect, to me, that candidate is very dangerous. What distinguishes Dr. Carson from everyone else, he's transparent, he's authentic, and he's honest. He has a lot to learn about foreign policy. He continues to learn it, and it will continue every day of his life.
All right, Armstrong Williams, thank you for coming in today and taking these questions. I think we'll probably have more for you in the days ahead. Armstrong Williams, thanks a lot.
We're going to make you a guest host or co-host.
We will. We'll be right back after this.
We're on the tube twice a day at 5 and at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, but we're live always 24/7 on our website, BloombergPolitics.com. When you visit the site, you want to make sure you check out our campaign tracker. It's got all the latest news, easily digested in 2016.
On tomorrow's show, we'll be talking to Senator Lindsey Graham. Until then, we will say to you, sayonara.